Welcome to the Lucas Rockwood Show. I am a yoga teacher, a trainer, an entrepreneur. I'm a nutritional coach. I'm a father, but first and foremost, I'm really a student. I love learning, and this show is all about scratching my own itch to learn, and I do my best to find smart people, authors, experts, medical doctors, researchers, human performance researchers, and bring them on the show to hopefully share with you some of their best information so that you can live, hopefully, a better, more inspired life. On this week's show, we'll be talking about just kind of an absurd race, a 3,100-mile race around one block in Queens in New York City. Literally, people just running around the block for 52 days, 59 miles a day, more or less, depending on if you're fast or slow, for 52 days. It's very difficult to even believe this is possible, but it's been going on every year since 1997, and every year people complete this. And this concept of, nobody's really watching. There's not a lot of fanfare around this race. There's not a lot of sponsors. There's not. It's more of a mental elite performance than it is a physical performance. But of course, the physical performance is undeniable. It's so difficult to go this far. But the mental fortitude probably outpaces the physical fortitude necessary to make this happen. This concept of what you do when nobody's looking is something that I really think about a lot. What do you do when you have an afternoon free with no responsibilities or no obligations? How do you spend your time? What do you think about or listen or physically do? Who do you call? Who do you contact? What do you read? What do you do with your time? And this concept that every summer there's a handful of people running around a city block is just really kind of fascinating. And to think about at that same time, you have handfuls of people at monasteries, you have handfuls of people who are watching Netflix, you have handfuls of people who are literally just laying on their bed, flipping through Instagram endlessly. What do you do when nobody's looking? How are you investing your time, and what does that really say about your character? And even probably more interesting than that is, what would you like to be doing when no one's looking? Because it probably matters. It probably shapes who we are. I think you'll get a lot of value out of this week's show. I apologize, the audio quality was a little bit sketchy. Hopefully you can hear most of it. Your comments, questions, and feedback are always most welcome. Email me, podcast@yogabody.com. Hello and welcome. This is Lucas Rockwood. I'm here with Sanjay Rawal. Today's show is called the 3,100-Mile Foot Race. Sanjay is a runner, a documentary filmmaker. He's made a bunch of films, Ocean Monk, Food Chains, and his most recent film, 3,100, Run and Become. We'll be chatting about this film today. This is a multi-day race, a 52-day race. You run 59 miles a day around a half-mile block in Queens in New York City. You just run around and around. We'll learn more about this story. While you're listening, check out 3100film.com, 3100film.com. Sanjay, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Lucas. It's a pleasure to be here.
So when I first heard about this, we've had a whole bunch of elite athletes on the show, people doing 50 Ironmans in 50 days and breaking all kinds of records and things like that. And I thought, it's another one of these extreme athlete things. And then I got on the site and I was like, whoa, this is a completely different thing. This is the running seems like number 3 on the list, number 5 on the list for the reason people are showing up to this kind of race. When I realized what this really involved, this is a physical feat, but really a mental feat as well. So I was really surprised to learn the history of this race and your connection with a guru in Queens. Just all of it is so quite surprising. It's not a traditional story. So maybe give people a little bit of context, because if I understand right, you grew up in Denver and somehow ended up following a guru to Queens that somehow led you down the path to creating this film about this race. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. In my teens, I began seeking, and I came across a spiritual teacher named Sri Chinmoy, who was from the Sri Aurobindo ashram in South India, but had made his home in Queens, New York City since the mid-'60s. And after graduating university, I moved to Queens to basically kind of like jumpstart an inner education. And in my 20s and 30s, until 2007 when he passed, I ended up traveling with him around the world and getting to spend time with a lot of his friends like Mother Teresa, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, Mikhail Gorbachev, the great peacemakers of the 80s, 90s, and aughts. That said, the thing that really drew me to his path was his combination of both inner aspiration and outer service. He felt that one couldn't realize the highest in this day and age without maintaining a pure link to the world. In essence, it would be very hard to kind of live a pure life as an aspirant in a Himalayan cave without being affected in some way or the other by the world. So why not embrace the idea that the divine is within each and every human being and live like you're a boat in the water, but not of it, as most of your listeners, know. That said, like one of the most important things in his spiritual pursuits was to maintain the strength of the body. And that's something that's been absent in a lot of spiritual traditions just in the last 300 years. And if you think of ancient India's, one of the greatest epics, the Bhagavad Gita, that took place on the battlefield. And the spiritual giants were all warriors. They proved themselves not only through inner discipline, but through extreme outer discipline as well. So Sri Chinmoy was really into running. And I'd been a runner in high school and in college. And for him, it wasn't just metaphorical that, running is like a metaphor for our own kind of like marathon run to the divine. He actually felt that running unlocked a set of experiences in consciousness that reduced the gap between the body and the soul. The idea was that if you could really inject the body with dynamism and inspire the body to listen to the dictates of the soul, most of the impediments like lethargy, somnolence, just sheer inertia could be removed, and your entire spiritual life, inner life, would be surcharged. So this is just a long way to say that he really encouraged ultra-distance running, and he was one of the pioneers in the movement for running multiple days in a row. And in 1997, the same summer that I moved to New York City, he started the 3,100-mile race, then and now still the longest foot race in the world.
Even when you say that, even though I've watched the trailer, even though I spent a couple hours researching, I still kind of balk just at the idea. 30, is that even possible? And so give us a little historical context for the marathon, the ultra, because these are actually, people always talk about Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile, these kind of things, but like this ultra thing, people aren't really paying attention to the level that human capacity has changed so dramatically in the past 40, 50 years. Give people a little bit of context, what a marathon was, 10 years before you and I were born, and what people are doing now, which just seems totally impossible.
So in a nutshell, even though, the Olympic marathon started in 1896, marathon running was an extreme counterculture activity, really up until the first 5-borough New York City marathon, which was a celebration of America's bicentennial in 1976. And that really popularized the marathon. At the same time, a lot of people who had been running the marathon, realized that it was no longer pushing the envelope. And so they started aspiring to run longer and longer distances, 50-milers, 100-milers. Interestingly enough, in the mid-'80s, the president of the New York City Marathon, Fred Lebow, he connected with Sri Chinmoy, and they started putting together 6-day races in New York City that required people to run around a 1-mile loop, as many miles as they could in 6 days. And you found a lot of the early adherents of the marathon began, pushing themselves into those distances. At the same time, Sri Chinmoy was fully encouraging of people pushing their outer limits, and he began creating races that would be at the boundary of the ultra-distance community and their own pursuits. And, just as an example, in 1997, in the first edition of the 3,100, there were, I think, 4 men and 1 woman. In last year's 2018 edition, the 22nd version, I think there were 8 men and 4 women. So more and more and more people are doing it. And just to put things into a little bit of perspective, the race is held in the summer on a half-mile loop around a high school in Queens. It's sidewalk, and people have to do 59 miles a day for 52 days in order to complete the distance. But the last thing I want to add is that in the movie 3,100 Run and Become, rather than keeping people, tied to this block, we really wanted to show that there's an ancestral, traditional connection that all human beings have to what we erroneously consider extreme feats of strength or extreme feats of fitness. We go to the Navajo reservation. We go to the Kalahari Desert with the Bushmen. We go to the highlands of Mount Hiei outside of Kyoto with the so-called marathon monks to really illustrate that there is no limitation to our body. Even though we look at the physical as finite, the capacity is much greater than we think it is.
And this race has completely captured my attention. And from what I understand, these are not your stereotypical people. I mean, I was chatting with my partner today, and she was saying, who has 60 days to go spend? What are we going to do with the kids? And I realized, like, wow, it's so much more than just running. To be able to set aside 60 days of your life, to be at a place in your life where you're either going to make that happen or you can make that happen. There's so many different layers to this, which I'm sure you've thought about much more in depth than me. But what is the profile of people who turn up? So there's like 12 people, a dozen people maybe every year turning up for this, or is it more people turn up at 12 finish? How does it work?
Well, so to kind of toot our own horn for just 2 seconds, like we got unprecedented access to this group of monks that live on Japan's most sacred mountain outside Kyoto. And once every 12 years, they pick an aspirant to trek for 1,000 days, split up over 1,000-day cycles. And it takes about 7 or 8 years. Those 100-day cycles range between 11.5 miles, the first few cycles, to 56 miles, the last couple. If the aspirant doesn't complete their daily mileage, they have to take their own lives. And this is a tradition that's been in place since around 500 AD, and it's conducted by the group of monks that first brought Buddhism to Japan. They first brought Tiandai from China, which in subsequent centuries combined with Japanese animist Shinto practices to form what's now called Zen. So these are the first Buddhists in Japan. But the suicide pact aside, very, very few people have ever had to kill themselves. The idea is to bring the highest level of commitment to the starting line. You don't think about the punishment or you don't think about quitting when you start the race. And in the 3100, everybody who's come, whether they've come from a strict spiritual background or kind of a more self-styled spiritual background, everybody comes into that race knowing that it's going to transform their consciousness. And if they don't have a practice where they understand what that experience is like and how to approach it and how to approach problems not on the physical but on the inner level, then they don't even make it to the start. So the race is a race for spiritual seekers, more or less.
And when you say problems, I mean the obvious problems I would think would be damaged, if not broken bones and feet and shin splints and just incredible blisters. Am I on the right path? Are there other things that people deal with? I mean,
that's a great question. Just thinking about the race and the distance and the conditions, makes one think about physical suffering. But from the Tibetan Buddhist standpoint, every single day we live, we're getting closer to our death. So life isn't in that tradition a process of living; it's a process of dying. And so, right? But the trick is to find the joy in that slow process of death. And so in the 3100, it's not so much about conquering pain; it's about getting into a flow of bliss and understanding that there are going to be road bumps, whether they're blisters, whether they're other types of ailments. And it's an understanding that, number one, the physical can't be neglected. You can't just run from bliss. You have to take care of all the things that come across your way. But at the same time, you can combat physical pain with joy. Doing the mindful and obviously not letting blisters fester, not running yourself to death. It's like there's an idea of perseverance, but there's also the idea of patience, because it is a 52-day race. You can't win the race in one day, but you can certainly lose the race in one day. So it's in a sense, it's an allegory for maintaining intensity towards enlightenment or God realization, which can't happen like instant coffee, but it's this long, sustained effort with an extreme view to practicality, but with inner intensity that can conquer whatever barriers are put in front of you.
And for the people who show up, how do they make things work logistically? Like, who's their caretaker? What are they doing with their life back home? Are they quitting their jobs? Are they retirees? Are they just figuring it out? Or what? I just get to the logistics right away. How do I find 60 days? Who's going to feed me when I'm after 14 hours of running around the block? How does that all work out?
So the race is it's all about logistics. There have been, and there are other races that run from like San Francisco to New York City, but the logistics are almost insurmountable unless you have a lot of money and can have an aid caravan following you. So in this race, because it's around a half-mile loop, every half mile there's food, there's aid, there's restrooms, there are RVs to rest, and there's a kitchen nearby that provides 10 to 12,000 calories per day per runner, according to the runner's dietary preferences and restrictions. There are people counting laps. Everybody's given an apartment within half a mile of the course, and they're driven to and from. So the logistics are stripped away so that runners can actually enter into that flow that human beings have experienced in running for tens of thousands of years. In terms of the profile of runners, that people gear their entire lives around this race. And it requires that kind of commitment where you just can't like show up, obviously. But at the same time, it's like you have to prepare your outer life for that. Like you have to either save up your vacation days, you have to have your own business. You have to have, if you have a partner, you have to have a very understanding partner. And in many cases, like the partners will come and take care of their loved ones and be their handlers. In other cases, the runners don't want their partners to be there because it's just, again, it's like a slow and steady deterioration, and having like the anxiety of someone who is literally afraid that your failure is going to or your death is going to completely alter their life. It's kind of too much anxiety. The people, for the most part, come alone, but they on occasion they bring a handler, for 2 to 3 weeks at a time and cycle through that. The race expenses are minimal, but the logistics to get there, might require somebody to save up, $10,000 to be able to maintain their life at home while they're in New York City.
And I only know this world from a distance, from people I've interviewed on the show and people I've met in passing. But I always assume that behind the scenes, people must just be pretty broken up. I mean, they must have osteoarthritis in their knees, and is that the case? I mean, I just don't know that I have 3,100 miles left in me in the next 20 years, much less in the next 52 days. Are people pretty busted up after these things, or how do they fare physically?
They're not, and this is where we go to, when we go to the Kalahari Desert in the film to spend time with the Bushmen who have been running and hunting for 125,000 years. The human body, it's made to run. There are a lot of things in our life that cause us to have injuries. Like, a lot of times, I think 95% of all running injuries come from the fact that we sit on chairs all day long. So the injuries don't come from running. The injuries come from lifestyle. They come from inflammatory diets. They come from poor sleeping practices, poor sitting practices, being totally, as you know, as a yoga expert, totally immobile in terms of our joints, our hips, our spines, and not paying attention to our entire body and expecting to be able to go out and run 50 miles and have no issues. That said, the longer you run, the looser your body gets. And the more the body understands, especially if you're running 16 to 18 hours a day, that inflammation doesn't get addressed when you stop. Inflammation gets addressed when there's circulation. And so the running is fascinating. It's energizing. I don't think there's any science around it, but, the anecdotal experiences of people fasting, after 1 or 2 days, the body almost enters into a different cycle where it understands this ancestral, human cleansing process. And I think the same thing is true with running. When you're running as though you're hunting, the body turns into a different mechanism. It looks at the animalistic level of survival to need to run 48 hours to catch your food, like the Bushmen do and did. And you begin burning fat. You begin your metabolism goes through the roof. You need to worry much, much less about the types of calories you're eating, and just have enough calories.
And so you're a runner yourself. What is your relationship with running, and how has your interest peaked or waned after getting so deep into this world?
Again, a great question. I ran competitively and I hated it because it was all about winning. And, when you train, and I think a lot of us who run with GPS watches and, who are on like social apps like Strava can relate, that before you start your run, you're already done. Like, in your mind, you're like, I'm running 6.5 miles. I'm going to do it at this pace. And then afterwards, I'm going to go to the bakery, and it's done. But when I went running with our one of our Navajo featured co-stars in the movie, the first thing I noticed was that when he left his doorstep, his mind and heart, I should say, were open to have a spiritual experience. And he said, and this actually echoes something that the 3100 founder Sri Chinmoy said, when you run, your feet are praying to Mother Earth. You're breathing in Father Sky or Father Heaven. You're praying to the holy people for their blessings to become a better person. Running is a teacher, and running is a celebration of life. And you realize that running is about consciousness. It's about completely opening yourself up to this part of life that we close ourselves off to. Like, we do not live in nature. We do not have a relationship with nature. We don't have a relationship with food, harvesting, the dirt, the air, the sky, the sun. And running, it is our connection to that. It forces the body to open up to all those energies if we want to. If we're glued to our watches, if we're plugged into our playlist, you never get that experience. But if you open yourself up to Mother Earth and to Father Heaven or Father Sky, as the Navajos say, that's when running becomes about becoming a better person. And that's totally changed the way I run, because now I realize that, like, running is as important to me now as meditation. Meditation for all of us is, the process of becoming better, more complete people, closer to the divine, or whatever ultimate goal our lineage or traditions point us towards. Running is the same way. It's like you can become a better person through your run.
There's a couple of things that people often overlook with monotonous exercise like running or swimming, and a lot of breathing exercises we do in yoga, is because there's this rhythmic pace to it. You drop into a very specific breathing pattern, and that repetition of breathing pattern affects your nervous system. Yes or yes. There's no way around it, and so it's like a forced mindfulness factor that a lot of people don't really pay heed to, but it's a really important part of long distance running, long distance swimming. A meditation practice does this often by other methods, but when you alter your breathing pattern, especially in a very rhythmic over a long period of time, the effects on your nervous system are very measurable and very, very noticeable. And so it is absolutely forced mindfulness. And so it's not just like that it feels like meditation. It totally is. And I think a lot of people say, like, walking my dog is meditation. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe you're just thinking about, Netflix when you're walking your dog. But if you get deep into a run or a swim or a yoga practice or anything where your breath is slow and steady and rhythmic, it overrides your central nervous system, and by default, you're having an effect on your nervous system. You might have a couple of those moments walking your dog, but you're so much more likely if you're doing an 8-minute mile or a 10-minute mile or whatever it is. Which loops me back to my question. The other thing that struck me about this is a lot of times I see these ultra races, and I see a lot of people doing them. Maybe it's a 100-mile race through the woods or whatever it is, and I realize that a lot of people are actually walking, and it's not actually a foot race, but this is too many miles. People have to maintain a running pace to even complete this, right?
Well, yes, when they're running, they're at between 10 and 12-minute mile pace. But, since you have to be eating a lot, and, the midpoints of the days, like between 12 and 6 p.m., are roasting hot in New York City, you do have to slow your pace down and bring in that idea of perseverance. But, I really keyed into your last episode, to Mark Lesser, and, even this idea of mindfulness and the kind-hearted critique of it that you make, and I'm 100% with it. Mindfulness is not a Hindu or a Buddhist word. It's like in in the West, we tend to look at the pursuit of the divine as something that requires concentration. But if anybody's had an experience with a teacher, whether you're on a path of mindfulness, so to speak, or not, you realize like the only way to make progress is to cultivate a sense of devotion, whether it's devotion to the Buddha, devotion to your practice, and that comes from the heart. All of these meditation apps, everything that's so-called mindfulness is only useful insofar as it opens up like the more expansive parts of our being. In effect, it's like the missing ingredient to spirituality that people discover after months or years of dedicated practice is the strength of the heart. It's the ability to go beyond and above and outside the mind and tap into something that's deeply expansive, deeply emotive. Like we don't feel love. We don't, in our minds, we don't necessarily feel joy in our minds. The idea of feeling comes from the heart center. And there are very few physical activities that silence the mind to such a degree that other chakras begin to open. And running is one of them. It's something that dissolves layers of the mind and actually enables people to feel a deep sense of spiritual emotion, not the fleeting kinds of ephemeral emotions that come from day-to-day life, but like a deeper, longer flow where peace is no longer just a moment of the absence of thought, but peace is a sense of fullness. And so I think that that's an added part of the argument that like is walking your dog mindfulness. Well, if you actually access your heart, which 99.999% people who are walking the dogs or chopping onions or like the example you used in the last episode, playing video games. Like if you don't enter into your heart, it's not mindfulness. It's not meditation unless it takes you into the heart. And so yes, like contemplative mindfulness, that's obviously that leads to all good things. And categorizing these outer activities in terms of their ability to open up consciousness, I think that's the added that's the subtext of what you're saying. And running is one of those ways.
So obviously you got enamored with this concept of this, 3,100 mile race. You have this deep history with your guru and queens and these kinds of things. When you showed up and you actually got into the weeds, was there anything that just totally surprised you that you weren't expecting, whether it was just the physical rigor or the emotional breakdowns? Was there anything that you just thought, wow, I was not expecting that to come up?
I was scared of this race, because I used to run the mile and 2 mile, and when I saw it and when I saw the people doing it, like the level of focus and commitment just reminded me of like the lack of those qualities in my own life.
Yeah.
And it's like for a lot of us, what gets us through life is like avoiding our inadequacies. And so like the race forced me to look at how deeply the runners were enjoying this race and how they were actually making spiritual progress through this race. And I had to realize that like they're more committed to spirituality than I am. And that was the most surprising thing, like spending time with them. And I would encourage people that whoever lives in New York or is coming to New York, the race starts on Father's Day every summer, like the third Sunday of June, and goes for 52 days. You can go to our Instagram page at 3100 Film and look at the geotags on a lot of our photos and, find the race there. Contact us that way or through our website and get more details about how you can show up. But, oh man, and I'm not going to critique any runner in particular, but like my friends who have done that race are so much nicer and so much more enjoyable to be around when they're doing that race. Like the runners they're like constantly blossoming flowers. It's amazing to see people in that state of fluidity and joy. Yes, when they're having problems, they're having serious problems. But when they're not, it's like they're their best selves, and they are better selves in those moments than I am in any facet of my life. And so I've become much more open to just being inspired by that journey and understanding that, although I'd like to do it one day, I'm not there now, but I can get a tremendous amount of inspiration from them.
One thing that I heard you mention in one of your interviews is that the race itself gets very little press. And, I lived in New York City for 6 years, and I never heard of this until 2 weeks ago, and I spent a bunch of time in Queens, actually, too, and I never heard of this. And it's just, I'm just really fascinated by the things that people do when nobody's looking. And a lot of these big endurance races, everyone's looking, everyone's snapping photos. It's all over the place. They get sponsors and all this kind of thing. It's really interesting to me, the idea that very few people are looking. It speaks so much to someone's character to think about it, to analyze, and just what are they doing when nobody's looking? And that person who for 52 days is running around the block all day long for 14 hours, that says a lot. It just says a lot. There's so many layers to there. I would like to meet that person,
It's interesting about running culture. I think more than any other pursuit, and I dare I say even mainstream yoga, like in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a really strong, powerful movement to connect mindfulness or spirituality to running. And there are so many runners who are trying to combine both an inner and outer practice in a way that I don't really see in other kind of mainstream approaches. Obviously not sincere hatha yoga, but like mainstream, like gymnasium-led kind of approaches to sport. And the 3100, every couple of years it gets an article in the New York Times or the Washington Post or like the Guardian. But in the last few years, I've just seen an influx of just regular runners come there because it is so accessible. It's like you can go and spend time around some of the best athletes in the world, and you don't have to go to the far reaches of the Rockies or the far reaches of the Sierras to witness some of the best, most committed, spiritual, mindful athletes doing something that's mind-blowing, even if one just spends 15 minutes on the course.
It's amazing. I can't wait to, hopefully someday I'll get there to at least watch. But Sanjay, for people listening, I know that a lot of people are going to want to watch the film. Give us the logistics. Obviously, we'll send people to 3100film.com. Can they download it? Can they stream it? How does it work?
Yeah, we're now on Amazon. We're now on iTunes in the U.S. and Canada. And so people can just search 3100 Run and Become. Luckily, we got great reviews. I think we're close to 86-90% on Rotten Tomatoes and 9.2 or 9.3 on IMDb. So thankfully, people actually really have enjoyed the movie, which means a lot to me.
Sanjay, really appreciate you coming on. I'm excited to watch the film. Like I said, I'm going to watch it this weekend, and I hope we can stay in touch for the future. One of the most common trouble areas for yoga students is their hips. People complain about tight hips and tight hamstrings probably more than any other spot on their body. The reason our hips are so tight in Western culture is because we never sit on the floor, we almost never squat down. In fact, our range of motion in terms of our hip flexion and extension is so shockingly limited that by the time most people are in their 20s, they can't really sit on the floor cross-legged comfortably. Their back's all hunched up and their knees are way up off the ground. And this affects all kinds of things. It affects your standing posture, your running gait, of course your ability to do yoga. Probably half the poses in yoga demand a certain degree of hip mobility. And it also leaves you susceptible to injuries. If you have dysfunctional movement patterns, if your posture is wonky, you can't really lift weight up off the ground. You can't really move like a fully functional human. So it's really important to open up your hips. It just feels great also. You're more comfortable when you travel. You can get through yoga classes more comfortably. You'll also find all different movement practices, whether you're weightlifting in the gym, out for a run, or just doing anything that you might like to do for fun, like skateboarding or surfing or whatever it is just easier when your hips are open. A lot of people don't even realize how blocked they are. I get a lot of questions. We teach a pose called Blaster in our Gravity Yoga series that's very popular. In any case, a lot of people want to come take my classes. I usually just teach training courses these days, so I'm not that accessible, which is a shame. I'd like to do more public classes, but I'm traveling, I'm teaching, I'm writing, I'm doing these podcasts, and I don't have much time. In an attempt to make myself more accessible and to connect with my listeners, I'm doing a 21-day hip opening challenge. It's a private program. It's available on Instagram in a private group. It's really simple. I know you already have Instagram. You just sign up for the program, you join through the app, and every day you'll practice with me live on video. I will share with you my best hip opening stretches. I'll answer questions. We'll talk about anatomy. I'll show you some bones and some anatomical stuff to think about and show you how to do gravity yoga breathing and practices to really open up your hips. Now, in 21 days, the question is, can I really make progress? And the answer is absolutely. You'll make huge progress. But even more importantly, you'll set the stage for some really massive transformations. When it comes to mobility, usually about 80% of the gains you'll ever make are made in the first year, and usually about half of those gains are made in the first month. So it's really big gains. You'll notice it right away, and it's pretty fun as well. Hip opening poses are really intense and very rewarding as well. I usually do it right before bed or in the evening because the breathing that we do with gravity yoga tends to put you to sleep. In any case, to learn more, go to yogabody.com. Scroll down, you'll see upcoming courses, the 21-day hip opening challenge. I hope you can join me. Today's nutritional tip is in response to a listener question. Listener Bobby J says, Lucas, I can't figure out what to do with eggs. Are eggs healthy? Is the cholesterol a problem? Is the saturated fat a problem? It seems like every day there's a new article. What should I do? Eggs are one of the more controversial foods. They go on and off the watch list. Here is a couple of things you need to know about eggs. Eggs do contain dietary cholesterol. The link between dietary cholesterol and heart disease is very weak. Previously, the idea was if you eat high cholesterol foods, your cholesterol goes up and you get heart disease. Those connections are not that clear. And so if you're worried about your cholesterol, if your doctor is worried about your cholesterol, it is one of many markers that could be indicative of a heart problem. But over half the people who have heart attacks don't have any cholesterol problem at all. So it's just, it's correlated, not causal. And so should you avoid dietary cholesterol at all? Probably not. In fact, plant-based people like myself, we probably have a problem with too little cholesterol. That doesn't mean you should necessarily eat eggs carte blanche. There are things to think about. Now, in terms of the saturated fat will raise your cholesterol levels. The dietary cholesterol and raising your body's cholesterol, that connection is not that clear. It's not a one-to-one, but for sure saturated fat will raise your cholesterol. So for example, I make sure to eat lots of saturated fat, so I do create my own cholesterol because I don't eat any dietary cholesterol. So should you be worried about the cholesterol in eggs? Probably not, but check with your doctor, because if you have an existing condition, maybe you should, and there are cases. But again, the cholesterol heart disease, this one-to-one thought that came out of the 80s and 90s has been mostly debunked, and there's a lot of great benefits to eggs. The thing you need to understand about eggs, if you look at the top 10 allergenic foods, wheat and dairy and corn and soy and eggs, they're all there. And a lot of this has to do with commercial farms. A lot of this has to do with modern agriculture. Egg farms are horrible places. They're an environmental and ethical disaster. They're not something that anybody wants to be a part of. But there are better practices. So it is possible to get now what are called pastured eggs. Definitely you'd want to get organic eggs. The price difference is ridiculous. Literally 3, often 5 times the price. So a lot of people really chicken out at the grocery store, and I understand, because you can get you can get eggs for 10 cents each, and if you get organic eggs, they can cost 50 cents each. So it's a dramatic difference. But for sure you want to eat higher quality eggs. If you can get off the chicken egg bandwagon, that will be better too. So let's say that you're eating any other kind of animal's eggs besides a chicken, because chickens are totally mutant, messed up, antibiotic laden, filled, sick, sad animals. It's really a sad state of affairs. At the same time, when we're talking about animal proteins and animal fats, eggs are pretty clean. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but if you go looking at farms, pig farms, dairy, chicken farms, all these kinds of things, the thing about eggs is it's an embryo, and animals, including humans, our biology does everything it can to protect an embryo. This is why you will have it's possible to have a very healthy baby born to a very sick mother. It's possible to have a very healthy baby born to a mother who is addicted to drugs, to a mother who is HIV positive, to a mother who has full-blown cancer. It happens all the time. We are wired for procreation as our chickens. And so if you're looking at the biomagnification of toxins, if you're looking at chemicals and pesticides and antibiotics, an egg is actually a pretty safe protein and fat that's coming out of the animal industry. Let's say we took a conventional chunk of beef, a conventional chunk of pork, and a conventional chunk of chicken, and a conventionally raised egg. That egg, due to the nature of the way that it's cultivated, because it's an embryo, is actually pretty safe. Now, of course, that safety comes at the expense of that poor chicken shoved in a warehouse and the poor environment, which is just totally toxic. But it is something to know. When you're on the road and you're traveling and you have really poor food quality choices, an egg, an omelet, something like that is actually a pretty safe, at least for you as a human, choice. In terms of how many eggs, again, you really have to figure it out, but most of the dietary recommendations have been totally refuted and changed, and it gets changed every day. Eggs are high in saturated fat. Yes. They are high in dietary cholesterol. Yes. Does that matter to you? Probably not, but check with your doctor. They're a decent source of protein. You got about 6 grams of protein per egg, and most people can eat them pretty easily. If you want to include eggs as part of your regular diet, which can be a smart idea as long as you don't have an allergy, aim for organic eggs, and if at all possible, pasture-raised eggs. If you start going to local farmers markets, a lot of times you can talk to the farmer and you can find chickens that are raised totally normal, happy things, running around eating bugs and grass and all kinds of different things that chickens eat. So it's a confusing topic, and it's one that you have to keep coming back to because of the allergies and because of the way that most eggs are created. Hope that's helpful. We have a listener question from Kathy this week. Kathy says, really love the show. Appreciate the time and research you put into your topics. I've been digging into older episodes, enjoying them on my commute to and from work. I'm not sure if you've been asked this before, but my question is intermittent fasting for an underactive thyroid. Kathy says she's taking 0.25 micrograms of synthyroid, and she's heard that fasting could cause more metabolic damage to someone with an underactive thyroid, so should it be avoided? So first and foremost, Kathy, make sure you check with your doctor. Anyone who's on any kind of medication, never override the advice of your doctor. Sometimes your doctors know things that they don't even tell you. Best practice is always work with your doctor. Hypothyroid, so an underactive thyroid. Hyper would be overactive. Hypo is underactive, really common. And sometimes people will call this low metabolism. Metabolism is kind of a loaded term. It means, it's kind of a very general term that people use to describe very specific processes in the body, but let's just call it low metabolism, slow metabolism, sluggish metabolism. And it's very common right now due to different endocrine disruption problems, hormonal imbalances, that people have a low thyroid functioning. So fasting can slow down your metabolism, slow down your thyroid as well, because your body goes into starvation mode. Fasting is not the same as meal timing. Here on the podcast, we talk a lot about meal timing, and meal timing is not the same as fasting. That's why sometimes people use the word intermittent fasting, but I try to avoid it because it's really an exaggeration of what we teach. What we teach is very natural. You have at least a 12-hour turnaround between dinner and breakfast. So if your last meal is at 8 p.m., first food in would be the next day at 8 a.m. Totally natural, really safe, not going to affect your thyroid negatively. In fact, it'll probably have a positive effect. And then if you're pushing things a little bit more to reset your metabolism, to increase your sensitivity to hormones like insulin and leptin and boost your human growth hormone, things like that, you might push it to 14 hours. So maybe your last meal is at 8 and your first meal is not the next morning until 10 a.m. Or maybe you really want to push it and spend a month or so just really resetting your hormones and fixing your sugar metabolism, lowering your blood glucose and that kinds of things. You might do a 16 plus 8. So maybe your last meal is at 8 p.m. and you wait until noon the next day before you have your first food in. That's meal timing. It's not extreme, it's not radical, nothing at all. Now, depending on your thyroid condition, it might be contraindicated, so check with your doctor. But for most people, it's going to be totally fine. What I'd encourage you to do, Kathy, is go to your doctor, say, hey, I'd really like to work on some meal timing. I know that there are a lot of metabolic benefits. I know that it'll, improve my sugar metabolism, my sensitivity to leptin and insulin. I'd like to start with 12 hours between dinner and breakfast. Is that a safe thing to do, doc? If doc says, okay, give that a try for a while, then maybe bump up to 14 hours if your doc gives you approval and see how you go from there. In many cases, this kind of meal timing can be really helpful. Now, what would a fast be? So a fast, let's just define it as a full day without food. People do all kinds of funky fasts. People do water fasts for 5 days, 14 days. There's some really interesting health benefits. There's some really negative stuff that happens as well. I used to work at cleansing centers where psychologically and physiologically, people would really make a mess of themselves. They'd get kind of addicted to this rapid change, but people bounce back oftentimes worse than before. I'm not against it, but it's really something that should be handled with care. Real fasting, real deprivation of food for extended periods of time. Meal timing is not that. Meal timing is just giving your body a little bit of a break. Hope that's helpful. Kathy, check with your doctor and let us know how it goes.
This week's iTunes review is by Lily3 from the USA. Lily3 says, I first came across Lucas a couple years ago when I was looking to increase my flexibility with his gravity yoga program. Not only has that program worked, I was also pleasantly surprised that he has a whole podcast that supports healthy lifestyles, from vitamins to stress relief to eating well for individual needs and everything in between. Most of all, I really appreciate Lucas's honesty. He's not afraid to call it as he sees it, even if it means calling out popular brands for deceptive marketing. I learn something new with each podcast week, and the practice is everything motto is helping motivate me for sure. Thanks, Lucas. Thanks, Lily3. You have won the Yoga Trapeze. Email us at podcast@yogabody.com and we will ship it to you.
Breathing is one of the fastest and most powerful ways you can affect your nervous system, the pH of your blood, even your endocrine system. It's really dramatic how quickly you can impact your body, but most people don't understand it. If you go to yoga classes, the teacher just says, breathe deeply, breathe slowly. And we don't really understand what that means. I got really frustrated with this, so I put together a guide for you, my podcast listeners. Go to yogabody.com/how to breathe. Yogabody.com/how to breathe. You put in your email, and I'll give you this PDF. It shows you exactly how to do water, whiskey, and coffee breathing. These 3 specific practices, which all breathing falls into one of these 3 categories. Check it out. Let me know what you think. Yogabody.com/how to breathe.